First of all, I want to thank my gracious hosts for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm delighted to be here. I want to apologise for not being able to support their campaign by speaking in the Finnish language. You will have to put up with my poor English. I'm delighted to be here in the beautiful historic city of Helsinki. I bring greetings from the beautiful and historic city of London, where if you may have been reading or watching certain news media, you may think that in London today we have no fuel, no fish, no friends, and no Christmas because of the terrible crime of Brexit. I'm here to assure you that we have plenty of fish, plenty of fuel, and that there is life outside the European Union. But we do have some serious problems. And whilst we have plenty of fish and plenty of fuel, one thing we do not have enough of in England, in the UK today, is freedom of speech. The freedom of speech which we actually did, or our forebears exported around the world, along with colonialism and other not so good things. They exported free speech around much of the world. And today, in Britain, as across much of the West, free speech is under attack. And the consensus seems to be, so I'm going to talk about some British examples, which I hope will resonate, because they are the kind of things which have come from America to Britain and are going to the rest of Europe. And I think if they're not evident here already, they'll be coming soon to a public debate near you. The consensus now seems to be that there is too much free speech. The reality of there being too little free speech has been turned on its head. Free speech is a problem. It needs to be more restricted. It needs to be more controlled. It is dangerous. This is the political consensus in Britain now in relation to almost everything. Let me give you a couple of recent examples. You may have heard that a British Member of Parliament, a member of the governing Conservative Party, was recently murdered in public in Britain. David Amess, the MP for Southend in Essex, just one county down from where I live in East London. And a really horrendous crime committed in a surgery where he was talking to his constituents. He was murdered. The political reaction to the murder of David Amess, or one of the strongest parts of that reaction, was, this proves we need less free speech. We need more controls on free speech. We need to ban all this rudeness from Twitter. You might have imagined that David Amess had been murdered by rude tweets rather than multiple stab wounds inflicted by an alleged Islamist terrorist. We'll see when the trial happens what the reality is. But it was turned into another cause for why we had too much free speech. An absolutely bizarre twisting an argument. Meanwhile, at the behest of campaigners, our Conservative government, which is supposed to believe in freedom and free speech, or claims to, is introducing a new act called the Online Harms Bill, will become law, which will criminalise speech, particularly online, obviously, which is potentially, I'm just trying to get the wording right, is likely to cause psychological or emotional damage. That is a blank check, a free charter for anybody who wants to censor. Because if you say that what I've written or said has caused you emotional harm, how could I possibly disprove that? What could my defence be? So it's an open book for anybody that wants to censor discussion online, and that is the way that our law is going. We are living in a moment in the UK where more people are now being locked up for what they think or write or say than at any time since the 17th century. And that is likely to get worse as these laws are introduced. Just one more stark example. This week, football has for some time been in the kind of front line of the free speech wars. People trying to control what football crowds are allowed to say in Britain. And you may have noticed that in the European Championships in the summer, the England football team, despite having the most boring coach in international soccer, somehow made it to the final and only lost to Italy in a penalty shootout. And the unfortunate fact was that the 3 penalties missed were all missed by young black players, who then had an enormous amount of abuse heaped on them online. Most of it was from football fans like me heaping normal football abuse on them about their inability to score a goal from 10 yards when they're paid huge sums of money to do so. But a tiny minority of the abuse was racist. And one idiot posted a Facebook video of him berating these 3 young black players, 18 seconds long, of him doing some kind of racist tirade. This week he was jailed for 10 weeks for an 18-second Facebook tirade of racist abuse aimed at 3 footballers. He's an idiot, he's a moron, but 10 weeks in jail for an 18-second Facebook posting, which no one could say that provoked violence in the streets or it made somebody break another law. Nobody supported him. Even his friends told him that they weren't going to speak to him again if he didn't take it down, which is why he did take it down eventually. But the judge said he's got to go to jail to teach the rest of them a lesson, that you've got to be careful what you say, because the people in authority think we are all racist abusers, and they want to silence us one way or another. So these are some examples of the kind of things that have been going on in Britain. As I say, is a pattern that's been repeated across the West of free speech being seen as a problem and something that needs more restrictions. In addition to that, we have all the informal censorship of the kind of Twitter mobs, as they call them, which are driving people off social media, driving people out of universities, making anybody with a critical voice silent. Now, what is happening? How do we get here? A bit of historical perspective. If I say to you, free speech is under threat in the West, you would be entitled to shrug and say, what else is new? Free speech has been under threat in the West every time it has reared its head. Ever since the free citizens of ancient Athens took a democratic vote to put the philosopher Socrates to death for talking out of turn nearly 2,500 years ago. And every time free speech has become to the surface in society, particularly over the last 250 years, we can say free speech is under threat. But the threats come from different directions according to different historical contexts. You know, and it begins with the threat of the established church and state to crush religious dissidents and Protestants. It's always worth remembering when religion becomes an issue in these things that the fight for free speech began as a fight for religious freedom. And we should always recognise the importance of religious freedom, even those of us who are not religious ourselves, when we talk about freedom of speech. So it begins with that, goes through the 19th century, the 18th century, the British Crown trying to suppress pamphleteers at home and American rebels in the colonies by denying them freedom of speech, jailing them, maiming them, hang, drawing and quartering them for what they say. In the 19th century, the American Republic denies freedom of speech not only to slaves, but to anybody agitating against slavery. The famous ex-slave and campaigner, Frederick Douglass, made the point at the time that freedom of speech is the freedom which tyrants fear most, and that freedom of speech for 5 years would break every chain in the slave-owning South of America. And that's why they suppressed free speech so violently then. And then we had the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century of Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. Very familiar in this part of the world, obviously, as a threat to the freedoms and free speech of the citizenry. But what all those have in common, those historical, also slightly different, is that they're all a question of those in power seeking to maintain control, to stamp down from the top down to keep control. Now what we see is something different, or in addition to that. which was we have the birth of something that's almost like grassroots censorship. For the first time, those who claim to be from the left, who are campaigning for change, for social justice, for equality, are campaigning against freedom of speech. Always a great left cause, always a key part of any campaign for liberation and equality, as now the so-called progressive side of politics has decided that free speech is a problem and is demanding that the authorities take action against it. And that's a quite new kind of phenomenon. And they're being appeased and given into by the establishment, the powers that be, who are taking these steps to control free speech. For myself, from someone who comes from a left background and has always been a great advocate of freedom of speech, this is a terrible state of affairs that I find myself arguing all the time against those who claim to be on the side of equality and freedom, but who are against freedom of speech or more and more critical of it. So that's where we have what has been described today as a woke war on freedom of speech. Woke is one of those words that gets used in politics today. It's not a very, whether it's useful or not, I'm not sure, but it's all we've got. We've basically got a problem with political language. Left and right doesn't really work anymore, and we haven't got anything to replace it with that really makes sense. So we're kind of making it up as we go along. But when I say woke, you have an idea what I mean. This kind of coalition or coalescence of political correctness, of identity politics, of social justice warriors, of critical race theory, all coming together in this kind of moment that we might call woke. And what underpins them all in the woke war on free speech is the fact that they have lost faith in freedom of speech and democracy. And the left has lost faith in the freedom of speech and democracy because it's lost faith in humanity. Those things are always very closely connected. And it's really lost faith in its own ability to win the argument. It says, the reason that we can't achieve our aims is because people are ignorant racists, and we can't win the argument with them, so we've got to shut them up instead. And that's the kind of fundamental basis of the woke war on freedom of speech. It's been building up for a very long time. In another life, in the 80s and 90s, I was the editor of a magazine in London called Living Marxism. Living Marxism magazine, a real troublemaking kind of left-wing publication. And just after we launched Living Marxism at the end of the 80s, the Salman Rushdie Satanic Verses scandal happened. Everybody remember that? The huge backlash across the Islamic world against the publication of Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses, which includes various passages relating to the Prophet's life. And when that huge backlash happened, we published a front page of Living Marxism defending the right to be offensive. To make the point that being offensive, the right to offend other people, is a key part of freedom of speech. That the freedom only to say what other people agree with or find inoffensive is no freedom at all. But we were kind of, even then, on the left, a very lone voice standing up for the right to be offensive, because already the movement for no platform, for denying people the right to speak if you disagreed with them, was taking off. And many people said, Rushdie's made a mistake because what he's written is too offensive, and it shouldn't be allowed to provoke these kind of problems, and putting the writer in the frame. That's 30 years ago. This has been coming on since then. By the time we get to the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris in 2015, things have gone much further. And despite all the Je suis Charlie protests in defence of the writers and the cartoonists, there was also a very large, apparently liberal left slice of opinion which said Charlie Hebdo has brought it on itself by being too offensive in what they've published. When the American Writers' Organization, American PEN, tried to give a special award, or did give a special award to Charlie Hebdo after the massacre, some of its most leading and prominent American writers boycotted it and said Charlie Hebdo was racist and Islamophobic, and they couldn't side with it, even after its journalists and cartoonists had been slaughtered in the streets. Salman Rushdie gave me a lovely quote for my book at the same time, was part of the very strong backlash against that anti-Charlie Hebdo movement. And I wrote at the time in my book that with the movement in the West against offensive speech, to control offensive speech, you could almost see the murderers of Charlie Hebdo as not only the representatives of an old Eastern religion, but also the kind of armed wing of a modern Western cultural movement. And that's how far things have gone. And when we end up with the murder of the French teacher Samuel Paty in the street, most of the discussion was more or less trying to pretend that it was some kind of tragic accident, rather than him being beheaded by an Islamist as part of a backlash against him teaching free speech in a French school. And now we reach the point where even in America, the modern home of free speech, as it likes to think of itself, with some justification, the American Congress of Civil Liberties, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, the most prominent pro-civil liberties, pro-free speech campaigning body in the world, no longer supports freedom of speech for people who say the wrong things, particularly in relation to the trans issue. The ACLU, which in the past defended free speech even for Nazis and racists, even though they're left liberals themselves, has now taken sides against teachers who object to being made to use the correct pronouns in class. That's how far we've gone, that even the ACLU, the left liberal campaign for freedom of speech, has become part of the problem. And in the woke war on free speech, you see how their arguments and their campaigns are advancing and becoming ever worse. So we begin with the idea that you shouldn't be able to say things which are offensive. In my book, I invented a category of the Reverse Voltaires. People are familiar with the famous Voltaire quote, actually written by his British biographer, but it kind of summed up what he said, what he was writing about, that I may disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. It's a kind of famous Voltaire statement of what freedom of speech means in the West, from France onwards. The reverse Voltaires that I kind of invented for my book are those who say, I hate what you say, and I will fight till the death of free speech to deny you the right to say it. Or if you do say it, to make sure you're punished as a consequence, and nobody else makes the mistake of thinking they can get away with saying it again. The reverse Voltaires are very powerful lobby in Western society. That's how it began. And now we've reached the point where we've gone further. Not only is it you can't say that, I talk in this book about the culture of you can't say that as being a response to so much, rather than having the argument out, they want to suppress it. Now we have not only you can't say that, but you must say this. That's what all of those Black Lives Matter campaign banners said, silence is violence. That's what they meant. Not only that you have to speak, but you have to read this script. You have to say what we tell you to say. I'm happy to take your questions afterwards. We just get past this. Silence is not violence. Compelled speech, being forced to say something that you don't believe in, has always been as bad as censorship and seen as such in the American First Amendment and the American Supreme Court. But now they're told not only that you can't say this, but you must say that. So that's a step further. Similarly, we begin with we begin with the idea that if we think something is not true, we must censor it. We must shut it up. So you have arguments against and laws against, across Europe, Holocaust denial, for example, which then moves on to saying we ought to ban climate denial, as it's so called. I don't agree with that argument either. I don't even agree with banning Holocaust deniers, because the way you deal with these people is to have everything out in the open, have it properly exposed. The British philosopher John Stuart Mill, in the 19th century, in his wonderful book On Liberty, made the point that there are two ways to say that something is true. One is to say it is true because we have allowed it to be questioned and challenged at every opportunity, and the truth has won out. The second way is to say it is true because we say it is true and nobody's allowed to question it. And that's the world we're living in now. And that's a very dangerous one because it means all kinds of fools and idiots can be turned into martyrs by being locked up for Holocaust denial, rather than having an open discussion of history. So I didn't agree with that anyway, but now we've moved on to something else, which is not only you must be censored because we say you're a liar, you must be censored because you're telling the truth. Because you say women have cervixes. Because you say there are two sexes, you must be censored and shut up. You're a danger to society with your harmful speech. So again, it's moving forward all the time, changing the terrain of battle. So it's in a sense saying they want to control not only what we can say, but what we are allowed to think. I mentioned the trans issue. I think there's a very interesting discussion to be had, which I won't go on for another 10 minutes about now, about why it should be that a relatively small number of trans activists have become such major players in the debate about free speech, have become so much in the front line of the attack on free speech. And I think that's a question well worth asking and talking about. But regardless of that, the point is that those relatively few, very angry trans activists and their supporters could never have achieved what has happened in terms of rewriting the whole terms of a discussion of free speech in the West if it hadn't been for the fact that those in authority, that the establishment, those who claim to defend liberal rights, have collapsed, have appeased them, have given in at every blow. I saw somebody make a point very recently that in America they have a culture war, whereas in Britain and certain other societies we have a culture surrender, where we've given up without even fighting. And that's my worry about the free speech wars today, is not only are we going to lose, we're going to lose without even having the fight. And I think that's something that worries me greatly. So, finally, what is to be done? We've got to go back to basics, I think, and fight for free speech by establishing that it is fundamental to our civilization. That freedom of speech really is the embodiment of the idea of a society of morally independent, autonomous individuals who can speak and think for themselves. But to do that, we have to remember two things about free speech. One is that it's free. That means free for all, not just for our friends or those that agree with us. But as one old American judge once said, we must defend freedom for the thought that we hate. And people say, how can you defend free speech because we defend it for all or for none at all? People say, how can you defend free speech for these terrible, vile individuals? Because that's what I spend most of my time doing when I'm writing about free speech. It's defending people I disagree with fundamentally. The point is, it's only the offensive and the extreme that needs defending on the grounds of free speech. The mundane, the mainstream, can look after itself. No one's saying we're going to burn these books because they're too boring. It's only the extreme, the offensive, those on the edge which need to be defended. Whether we like what they say or not is not the point. The point is to defend freedom of speech as a double freedom. The freedom to express your opinions, what you believe to be truth, and our freedom, this is very often forgotten in this discussion, our freedom to listen to you and judge for ourselves whether we take you seriously or not. It's a double freedom of speech. And when you deny somebody freedom of speech, you also deny the rest of us the chance to judge for ourselves. Very important. Now, just in relation to something that came up earlier today, does freedom of speech mean everybody gets the same right? Does it mean that anybody can come in and say, we must have a platform on your conference because you're about freedom of speech? Of course not. It's still about making judgments, editorial judgments. The people who control a conference decide who speaks at it. Of course, nobody has the right to a platform. You have the right to freedom of speech. That doesn't mean we have to listen to you. You have to earn the right to be listened to by making your argument persuasive, and that's an important kind of rider for those things. So we have to remember that free speech is free, and we have to remember that it's only speech. Speech is tremendously important. It's very, very powerful. But words are not, in the way that they're often talked about today, violent weapons. However fast I talk, it's not the same thing as a machine gun. However blunt my arguments are, they're not the same thing as a baseball bat. And we should not confuse the two. There's another debate about incitement and whether words incite violence, which I'll be very happy for us to talk about, but I don't want to spend another 15 minutes talking about it now. But that's a very important issue, and I'm ready to answer anybody's questions on that. But we should remember speech is got to be both free, and we remember it's speech. What about the law? We have to, I think, stand against all of the hate speech laws which are spreading across Europe and beyond, and which I know the EU has tried to force Finland to accept. Hate speech laws which only make things worse as a matter of both of principle and in practice. Then there's the argument that can we have good laws as the solution to this? I know you've already talked a bit, I think, today about the First Amendment to the American Constitution, which is still the gold standard of pro-free speech law. 14 words of the First Amendment which say something like, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. That's it. 14 words. Not the 1,000-word constitution documents that we're familiar with in Europe. 14 words which establish the gold standard. And I know in Finland also there is a constitutional commitment to freedom of speech. But those laws in themselves do not prevent the encroachments on freedom of speech. What's happening in America on the campuses, the attacks on free speech on American campuses, on free speech and academic freedom, is happening despite the First Amendment. So the law itself is not enough. An American judge at a Liberty rally in the Second World War made the point very clearly that to the people of New York, that a Judge Learned Hand, that we cannot rely on courts and constitutions to defend freedom of speech. That freedom of speech lives and dies in the hearts and minds of men and women. And if it lives there, no court or law can get rid of it. If it dies there, no court or law can defend it. That's the important thing. We've got to win people over to their hearts and minds to defend free speech in a culture war. Voltaire, who I talked about earlier, and I'll finish now, my favourite Voltaire quote, even more than the one about freedom of speech, Voltaire said that he who picks up a pen is at war. Right? You're in a war, a battle of ideas, a war of words, and that's what we are in now, whether we like it or not. We are in a war to defend freedom of speech in our Western societies and beyond. The stakes are very, very high, and we have to insist that free speech remains the most important liberty and the key to all others. 350 years ago, or thereabouts, the great Enlightenment philosopher Spinoza, a man who knew something about cancel culture in his day, his family having been driven out of Portugal by the Inquisition, and then him being kicked out of the Jewish synagogue in the Netherlands for his heresies. Spinoza said, setting, I think, the standard for any free and liberal and civilized society, in a free state, every man, and we would add every woman plus, in a free state, every man may think what he likes and say what he thinks. In a free state, every man or woman may think what they like and say what they think. 350 years later, sometimes we seem to be even further away from attaining that goal as the kind of gold standard of our civilization. We're in a war, we need to start fighting it, and I hope that we can win. Thank you very much.